What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 10 cash game review, going over our lineups from yesterday, the Week 10 slate. I am TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com, as always, with my co-host, Matt Savoca. Before we get into everything today, just want to tell you guys about the easiest and most fun way to spice up your fantasy football season. It's Underdog Fantasy and their brand new Pick'em game. Just pick the over or the under on your favorite or at least favorite player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players, and you could take home some cold, hard cash. Head over to 4for4.com/underdog, claim your free 4for4 Pro subscription, and get $10 in bonus cash to play this weekend. Matt, how was your Week 10, sir?
It was pretty good. I had a decent week. It was 44th percentile in some of the big double ups that I entered, but as we've talked about before, some people enter a train of lineups in there. So I think its real life performance was actually right around 50th percentile. And I won 49% of my double ups and head to heads, which ultimately resulted in a break even day, but positive ROI if you don't include the 3x or the 5x tournaments. And this is something we've talked about. Some people include it in their cash budget, their GPP budget. It doesn't really matter. It was just a solid but not exciting cash game. It was day for me.
It was one of the most fascinating weeks maybe we've ever had, which obviously we'll get into with the two obvious plays with Dearness and Mark Ingram. So for cash, I think it kind of narrowed a lot of our selections that we had early in the week, obviously, because you're taking 2 running back spots. There was a ton of super interesting GPP theory, but that's not what the show is about. On FanDuel, we always have a ton of studs that we can look to. I mean, if people read your article this week, they noticed your player pool was really big. And again, that's just always kind of going to be the natural state of FanDuel, and why I think FanDuel is actually a little bit harder for cash games, because there are you always have access to the best players and the highest ceiling players, and then especially this week when you have basically 2 free squares. So let's get into it. Where did you lock up your what were your obvious plays this week? I mean, we could talk about Dearness and Ingram, but I think those are pretty obvious. But outside of those as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so obviously this wasn't the original lineup I set as the 1 p.m. game started. I was struggling in the early parts, and once again, as has been a running theme for me, some of my players hit in that final hour as we're trying to decide our late swap options there. But I was still locking in Josh Allen against the Jets. I was definitely going to take that value. Almost 2 touchdown favorites against the worst defense in the NFL and schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses. That was an easy one. From there, it was obviously the 2 value running backs, and then to distribute that value at wide receiver with the highest value plays and some high ceiling plays based on how the 1 p.m.s went. So originally, I had a lineup of Allen, Johnson, and Ingram, and then I had Evans, Keenan Allen, and Devontae Adams as my wide receivers. And then in the flex position, I actually had James Conner, a 3rd value running back, with something I don't typically do, but because I liked where the rest of my lineup was at, and knowing that I had more late swap optionality, Conner actually left about 500 in salary on the table that I was going to be able to utilize in that late swap window. And sure enough, I found myself kind of struggling at that halfway point. So I had a tough decision point, and I definitely would consider this part a miss beyond the Christian McCaffrey pivot. I knew if I needed help in the second part, I was going to Cook or McCaffrey based on how badly I was doing. And I ended up choosing McCaffrey. The 2v2, I wish I had gone the other way, because instead of Lockett and Thielen, I really wanted Jefferson, who had a much higher value ranking, but I would have had to downgrade to either Rondale Moore or Devontae Smith. And I would have possibly walked into that huge Devontae Smith score, despite that being a so-so cash play on paper.
There was actually like with the Ingram and the Dearness news, and then especially on FanDuel with salaries already being fairly loose, like there were some builds where you felt like you had the some of the best players at each position, and you were leaving a lot of salary on the table. Like it was almost like it was one of these weird weeks where it felt like, were you like spinning up just for the sake of spinning up? That's how much salary was available. So that actually makes a ton of sense. I mean, what was like the final decision in that 2v2? Like what I talked a lot about that Seahawks and Vikings game actually. And I thought both game flows, there was a lot of opportunity for everybody. Obviously that Green Bay game ends up being a dud, but I think that was like that game should have had a lot better game flow. But what was the final decision point in going to those guys?
Yeah, it really came down to trying to balance ownership with ceiling projections.
Mhm.
And Lockett, from a ceiling play, had the fifth highest ceiling projection in our FanDuel projections, and Thielen was up at seventh. But if you looked at the straight value rankings based on projection, it wasn't really close. JJ was sixth, and I believe Thielen was 16th, Lockett a little below that. So ultimately, it felt like I was going too far off the board
Yeah.
with Moore or Devonta Smith, and it felt
Yeah.
like I had
Yeah.
more. I don't know, maybe more floor, but also noticing that the ceiling scores for both the players I was choosing was so high, it just felt a little bit safer. Again, I don't know if I should have been playing for safety at that point.
For sure. Yeah.
Um,
I agree.
eh, so, it doesn't look like a bad miss to me, but ultimately, Devonta Smith scores 20 points. Jefferson is a huge value at his salary, and that probably walks me into an even better ROI day.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a huge miss either. Like they were the Seahawks, they took some shots and a couple of them were at Lockett. I mean, Russ was throwing them into like pretty tight coverage every single time, but if Lockett connects on any of those, then you're telling a little bit of a different story. That's how thin it is. And when you are playing a play like that, a late swap, a Russ coming off of an injury, you really are just playing for that upside when you do swap to that. I mean, that's the risk that we're supposed to be taking. I mean, we could get into some of your misses and decision points first. The one I'm interested in talking about, and you don't have it listed, but is the Dalton Schultz play. There were a lot
Yeah.
of value. There were a lot of value tight ends available this week. Like, what ultimately landed you on Schultz versus some of the other players like Arnold? I think Fryermuth probably was off a lot of people's board once Big Ben was out, but Dan Arnold or some of the other guys that were available.
Yeah, kind of a bummer because I had Dan Arnold going into Sunday morning. My Saturday night build included Michael Pittman and Dan Arnold,
Mhm.
and when I pivoted off Pittman, I didn't feel like Arnold was such an imperative play that I was going to use
Yeah.
him outside of a game stack as a one-off play. If I was going to have a one-off play, why not a tight end in the highest total game on the slate?
Right.
The team scores so many points and Schultz still doesn't get there. Ultimately looking how that game flow went, I almost say Schultz wasn't a bad play anyway. The points just happen to funnel to CD. Dak gets a rushing touchdown, and that's just how football goes
Mm.
sometimes. But the only real the only real decision point actually I had at noon on Sunday leading up to this lineup was, with that salary remaining over, do I try to sneak a higher salary tight end in there? Ultimately, I said no because I could just save that salary for late swap, and I needed it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, that Dallas game was actually a tough one for me, and again, we'll get into it when we get to the DK portion. But I actually ended up with no Cowboys in cash just because I do think the range of outcomes for that whole team is so high. Like they score what 40 some odd points, and and guys like Schultz still aren't getting there just because they have so many
Mhm.
players that could that could score fantasy points. I mean, they have Tony Pollard going for over 100 yards on the ground. Like that's taking up so much yardage from a backup running back. Obviously, it's a blowout situation, but yeah, there's just a lot of players that can bust on that team even on good days. Let's get to some of your other like major decision points. We talked about some of the late swap and some of the Dan Arnold talk, but like Mike Evans was one that probably like wasn't a slam dunk for you. You probably had some switching around you were doing when you were building your lineup. So talk about Evans and some of the other options that you had there.
I truly expected Evans' value number to change throughout the morning as
Yeah, me too.
Godwin was more and more it became more and more clear that Godwin was going to have close to his normal role, and that's really
Mhm.
what he did. I think Evans had 35 routes run and Godwin had 33. So at the end of the day, I believe he had the highest value ranking on FanDuel. So I'm not
Yep.
going to go away from that at all. And there were some lineups basically the same exact build, but just try to sneak Justin Jefferson in there.
Mhm.
AJ Brown was popping as well for me at by kickoff, but ultimately I'm just going to go with the value ranking there
Yeah.
because I was fitting Devonte Adams in on top of that, and just in general, a lineup of Evans, Allen, and Adams feels like a very very strong wide
Yeah.
receiver core. Again, I moved away from it. The optionality was there, and even that 13-point game, he doesn't kill you either.
Right. No, no, he was, I mean, he was fine. He obviously gets there super late on that long score. But I was actually really, Evans was weird for me because we got the news late Saturday night that Godwin was likely to play.
Mm-hmm.
So I stayed on Evans. I thought he was a good value. I kind of thought it would play out like it did in terms of Godwin maybe being limited. But from how the industry perceived it, I really thought that less people were going to be on Evans. I mean, and this is more like GPP talk, I guess, but I just thought people were going to kind of split the difference between Evans and Godwin once we found out that Godwin was most likely to play. And Evans ended up being mega chalk in GPPs. Again, that doesn't have much bearing on what we were going to do in cash games, but I didn't know how people were going to attack the Tampa Bay game. I thought it was just really important to have pieces of the Tampa Bay passing game in some respect, because that, I mean, even though they don't get there as a team, like they're just a team that there's so much passing volume and so much passing upside that they, compared to like the Cowboys, it felt bad to me to not have some Tampa Bay pass catcher in there just because they throw so much. Teams throw so much against Washington. That's just how they get their points. So I thought it would have been pretty bad to not have Evans even once Godwin was activated.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting compared to how you see it. I kind of saw those two situations and those two offenses last week more as a toss up.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, this was just a straight value play.
Yeah.
I do agree. The Washington pass defense is, showing itself to be one of the biggest pass funnels up to this week. That game
Mm-hmm.
flow was also just super weird. The
Yeah.
multiple turnovers early, and we could have seen ceiling games there anyway.
Yeah, I think so too. Is there anything that you noticed in some of the top tier lineups that you didn't land on in yours? I mean, obviously, there were some scores that went nuts, but is there like any process plays that you noticed in some of the higher scoring lineups?
Yeah, there's a lot of stacking going on. Just little mini stacks, or sometimes a stack and a run back, but people
Yeah.
aren't shying away from it at all, especially in these great offenses in smash spots like the Cowboys, like the Bills. Allen and Diggs stacks. Diggs finally has that huge game. Thank you. Thank you. Like it just felt like a
Yeah.
big
Yeah.
exhale. And then Dak
Yeah.
and CD stacks obviously paid off really, really well. One thing I did not expect is that the pivot to a player like Ramondre Stevenson at that
Yeah.
middle salary, similar to that Mark Ingram range, was going to be so effective. Essentially, you couldn't get that spot wrong. And then, of course, lots of Jonathan Taylors, lots of Devonta Smiths, lots of Cowboys, Packers, and Eagles defense. The Panthers hit 3x as well.
Yeah.
Honestly, a lot of these defenses that we've been touting all week did pretty darn great.
Yeah, I mean, running back, like obviously JT has the big game, but there were 6 or 7 running backs, if you include uh Dearness and Mark Ingram, that were like legit ceiling plays. So I mean, like if you play Dalvin instead of JT, it's not egregious. It's good. If you play Eckler instead of JT, it's still a good play. What like I know we already talked about the Cowboys a little bit. I was surprised to see as many CD lineups as I did in cash. It just felt like he wasn't popping as a crazy good value. Obviously, any of those Dallas receivers in that spot are good plays. And I guess maybe it just has to do with the fact that so many people were playing Dak, then they're like, let me get to CD. But how were you like approaching those receivers, Dak? I'm sorry, not Dak, but CD and Amari. Like I just didn't. They never really popped as cash game plays to me.
I think we're overthinking it right now. I
Yeah,
honestly think people look at the game total and they see the highest number next to
yeah,
Dallas's name and that they're favored by so much, and they're like, okay, I'll stack Dak
yeah,
and a wide
yeah,
receiver. I literally think it's that simple.
yeah. That make. I
I
mean,
mean, like
that
he's
probably,
getting 8, 9 targets a game over the last 3 weeks. Like it's not certainly with that high of an implied team total and knowing that volume is likely there. That's fine. That's sort of how I felt about Schultz. That huge, heavy home favorite, high game total, likely 6 to 7 targets. Book it at a
yeah.
salary.
No, for sure, for sure. That makes sense. I was just like, it was just like I just never felt like I was ever going to roster any Cowboys besides Dak in cash. The Ramondre thing was crazy. I mean, obviously it makes sense that you can get there in GPPs, especially with it being a pivot off of Dearness or a correlation with Dearness, however you wanted to play it. I don't know how the hell you get there in cash. Like when they didn't even say
Right.
in pregame, they said Bolden was the starter. Like Bolden, that's who they said we're taking starter snaps. So like if you're playing Ramondre in cash, like it hits, but that's not a good play. And I'm not I don't bash people for, they're for winning. I'm not like, the donkey one. That's not fair. But that's a very, very bad play. I don't know how you land on that.
I agree. I agree. Especially with such an obvious. We talked about this on Friday a little bit. There was such an obvious build with the free square running
Yeah.
backs, and then using that value to pay up to premium wide receivers and the onesie positions. Hey, if you game stack Cleveland and New England, you probably made a lot of money. So good for you.
Yeah. Any last thoughts on FanDuel?
I think that's it.
Cool. Let's move on to the DraftKings lineup. I had what you would probably call a ceiling week.
Yeah, I
96,
would.
96 percentile in the big $100 double up. I think it's called the Giant. I'm not sure what it's called. I always forget because I just hit click and enter my lineup. But a good week, a very good week for me. And I'll get into some of the process on why it ended up being such a good week and why I benefited from the ceiling, not just with head to heads and double ups, but the build for me, obviously, once we get the news that Alvin Kamara is out. Ingram becomes a lock. Dearness was a lock all week. And then for me, I was always locked into Mike Evans. Like you said, the Godwin news all week with him being unhealthy, it sounded like he was going to be the best value. And then again, after I was kind of the same process as you. As soon as we got word that he was active and I kept looking, he was still just popping as a value. He was down at 6,900, and then Devontae being sub 8K for me. It like those two guys were just not priced anywhere close to where I even thought about not having them in my lineup. Like even if I didn't get the Ingram free square, I was probably trying to figure out a way to get down to Evans and Adams on DraftKings.
Yeah, man, that makes sense here. And also, you keep Devonte Adams in there. Jonathan Taylor goes absolutely berserk, and then you
Mhm.
still have room for Josh Allen because the value running backs. It's one of those things where we know how the value metric on 4for4 works different than a lot of typical value
Mhm.
metrics on other sites because it factors in the ceiling probability,
Yep.
the schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed. So if he's still popping like that, then we just play the numbers at that point. Obviously works out great here.
Yeah, the value gives us apples to apples. It's not just point per dollar. So when it stays steady like that, you can usually be pretty confident in it. And it's actually been a point of emphasis for me is really trusting those values and going with those top plays.
It feels
And
a little
that
too easy, right?
yeah, it does, and that's actually why I ended up on Josh Allen. So when we got the when we got the news that Big Ben was out, that is what really like threw a wrench into my builds a little bit, because I was actually leaning into the Steelers players pretty hard. I was probably going to have like a James Washington, Najee Harris, Pat Fryermuth, some kind of two of those guys. Like Najee was kind of my RB1 all week because his workload has been so big. But once we found out that Big Ben was out, I kind of toyed with the idea of playing Mason Rudolph, because he did end up as our second best value on DK, and like going with a true like stars and scrubs build, and just getting three crazy good wide receivers with Josh Allen, or I'm sorry with Mason Rudolph, just get three really good wide receivers with them. And I was just thinking about it, and he did pop, and it just, if we only had one free square running back, I might do it. But when I have Ingram and Dearness sub 5K, the thought was just like, would I rather have a third good wide receiver, or would I rather have the player with who I thought had the biggest ceiling on the slate in Josh Allen? And like, just get Josh Allen in there. You could afford him. Like, he could go nuts in this spot. Like he has a great game, 2 pass touchdowns and 366 passing yards. And I was like, I wasn't buying into the idea. Like, everyone was talking about people playing these too high against the Bills, like they were against, like teams have against the Chiefs, and they need to get Zach Moss and going, and Devin Singletary. And I just
realized too high shell was this revolution in defense. It's a solid D.
Yeah, so I wasn't buying into it. I was actually more excited about them getting Spencer Brown back and thinking Josh Allen was going to play like he did. I mean, obviously, with all that said, Breida gets 2 touchdowns and McKenzie rushes for 1, so they actually end up establishing the run. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but Josh Allen still ends up having a really good game. But that was like my my big, like, I just get Josh Allen in there. That's what these running backs are letting you do. Any thoughts on, actually, let's talk about that. Like, how did you, because like I said, I got off all of this. I pretty much got off all the Steelers. How did you approach that? Because surprisingly, when Ben was announced out, the point spread only dropped by 1.5 points. So that's actually kind of why I was like, maybe Rudolph's not that bad of a play. Like, they're not even moving the point total, but obviously I never end up playing him.
Yeah, it's funny. I had some family in town this weekend. They're from Pittsburgh. We're sitting at dinner. The news about Ben comes out, and here's how the world has changed over the last 5 years. They start looking up the betting lines and seeing how the betting lines has changed. So that became the conversation of how much does the game flow really change. And I was actually of the opinion that the betting lines weren't adjusting enough. I feel like we've seen the Mason Rudolph show before, and it's terrible. And the wide receiver core is arguably worse than the last time he was in there at quarterback. Certainly the line isn't significantly better. You had Najee, but that's really it. So ultimately, I thought on FanDuel, with 2 value running backs, why am I attacking that game environment when there are such solid game environments to attack, like the Bills versus the Jets, like the Cowboys versus the Falcons, like the Buccaneers versus Washington, or just the game environment I thought we were going to have with Seattle Packers? I'll be honest, I played that game entirely differently. I went strong on the fact that that game was fundamentally misvalued, and I was playing it like it was going to go over. But I think that was okay, and that was more of a GPP call. In this situation, you just didn't have to go there, especially on FanDuel.
Yeah, so the game environment is kind of what ultimately ended up pushing my last couple decisions. And again, when I built before we got the Big Ben news, my last build before that was with James Washington and Najee Harris. And I actually told some people, I don't remember if it was on Twitter or in Discord, that I actually thought James Washington might still be an okay play because he was so cheap, and obviously he scores the touchdown and gets there for his 3,500. But I was talking to John Paulson, who does our projections, and after the Rudolph news, Tyler Johnson started popping way more than than James Washington. I still wanted a punt wide receiver in there, so I didn't include him in my player pool in the write up. But I ended up telling a Discord that I liked him a lot, and that was kind of the thought was that game environment with. I'm fine having Mike Evans and Tyler Johnson together, and then I'm looking at all of these tight ends. I didn't want to have Pat Freiermuth. I didn't know Dan Arnold was going to be so popular. He ended up in 60% of cash games. If I knew he was going to be that high, I'd probably just plug him in. So I was just thinking like, I think this is a horrible tight end week. So I don't even really mind. Like I kind of like the idea, even in cash games, of like when everybody's playing not great tight ends or sub 4K tight ends, like being a little bit contrarian, because I am still playing a ton of head to heads and I am still playing like 10x contests and winner take all. So like I don't ever want to be like contrarian just in cash games just for the sake of it. But like in these spots, like I don't think you're losing value when going from like Dan Arnold to RSJ, and like if RSJ goes off, like I can win my winner take all, or I could win 99% of my head to heads instead of 90% or something like that. So that's kind of the thought process there. I mean, RSJ gets hurt, Dan Arnold still has a good game, and then the other thing about it was ultimately when I had my original build in, when I start building with these cheap running backs, I realize I can get to the Cowboys defense. And I wanted, originally I had Tennessee. I didn't really want to play Tennessee against the Saints, against Mark Ingram. And then the Cowboys are these double digit favorites. And I'm like, I can get to them. Like, let me just play a 10-point favorite and let these other, like, save the $200 with Tyler Johnson to be able to do that. And then still be able to get up to JT, who once I thought it through, I'm like, JT ceiling is out of control. Like I think they just absolutely smashed the Jaguars. So when I like really sat and like thought through my top tier running backs, I'm like, okay, Dalvin hasn't been catching a ton of balls and they're actually underdogs. Eckler has, he can lose some work, and he did lose a touchdown to Larry Entry, and he has wide receivers that can really just take over the game, and a quarterback to take over the game. And even though Jonathan Taylor's not a huge PPR guy, I'm like, this is just a smash spot for him. So let me just get up to him. So that was kind of, and I kind of didn't want to correlate a Jaguars player in a cash game lineup, which is another reason I didn't love the idea of playing Dan Arnold. So that's kind of how I land on this build.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. The only things that I'm annoyed about is that if there were a couple weeks earlier, we probably see Stephon Diggs popping in the value metrics, and we're all playing Allen Diggs stacks, and we're getting 180 points instead. Yeah, that's really solid. Again, we're just when the value is about the same, or in the case of the defense, we mentioned this on last Friday's show on DraftKings, the value metric for every single defense was negative. Yeah. We're just going back to fundamentals, right? We'll just play the Vegas totals. And same thing with Jonathan Taylor, honestly. They were 10.5 point favorites going into Sunday. So if there's just a little bit of, or really no difference at all, just go back to the implied totals. It's that simple sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically exactly what I was doing with the point spread for the Cowboys, and that kind of, usually a defense doesn't dominate my decision, but I just really wanted to play a huge favorite instead of like the Titans or the Browns or something. Obviously, like I have a really good week, and I think the process probably was solid. I don't think I really luck boxed into anything here. Just kind of all came together. So like instead of talking about what worked in winning lineups, I want to talk about a late swap that worked. And going back to our point last week, talking about the fact that some people struggle with the concept of cash games and getting upside into your cash games and how the games are really tough. And that's why we talk about, like you talked about, playing these 3Xs, playing these 10Xs, and as I do, I always play at least one winner take all. And again, I do, and again, it doesn't matter how you like track your bankroll. Like we're just, if we're in the black, we're going to be happy. But I do include this in my cash game because this is my cash lineup. And when it goes off, I want to be rewarded for it. So even though it's winning a 10X game or a winner take all, that's still that lineup going off. And I want to be rewarded for that. So because I played those this week, my cash game lineup 5x'd its buy-ins. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that because like, if you aren't playing these games, that's what you're missing out on. So if you have this great week and you only play head-to-heads and double-ups, like you double your money, that's cool, but you're not capitalizing on this amazing lineup that you had. And that's like the point that I try to make when people are like, cash games aren't beatable. There's no upside. Like there is upside. You just have to, game select more. You have to think about what you're doing. And in my winner take all contest, I'm like top 5 or whatever, and I take the time to go through and one lineup ahead of me has Devontae. Obviously, you can't win a winner take all if they have Devontae. So I switched to Jefferson and win the winner take all. And again, that's not to say that I won, but to say like these little processes, this is how your bankroll like these thin margins, that's how you go from a winning player to a losing player. If you aren't doing these things and getting to a 5x day instead of a 2x day just by game selection, just by one late swap, I think that is probably as important or more important than what like. Great, I put together a good lineup. That's cool. Anybody could do that in a given week. Are you capitalizing on it when it happens?
Yeah, great call. And remember, guys, we can do this contest selection. We're allowed to go into FanDuel and DraftKings and reserve our spots in these contests on Saturday.
Yep.
We can do this well before Sunday. Build your lineups out. And, we have the ability with our 4-for-4 optimizer, we can export and then get your lineups in on Sunday as kickoff is about to happen. But this is a part of the process that we can just get ready for ahead of time. And regardless of the news, we want to capitalize on winning, just like you said.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing every week as well. Let's go into some like broad overview stuff. NFL, DFS, redraft. Anything catch your eye this week?
Yeah, super tilting because I feel like CMC was like an inch away from that 30 burger that I wanted him to have, needed him to have in the late swap.
Shoot, maybe a 40 burger, really, if you think about it. Yeah.
And he was like underowned. Like I thought he was an incredible play this week. Yeah. I love the idea of Christian McCaffrey at low ownership is my favorite play in DFS pretty much. But yeah, it was cool to see Cam Newton score. He makes Robbie Anderson a thing immediately. So you knew it was going to be a weird week. Yeah. And then Jacoby Myers scores. So you got to like, I don't know. Do something crazy at that point.
Yeah. Celebration.
That was really cool. And then Dallas pulling a Golden State Warriors and going from 7-3 with 13 and a half minutes left to 36-3 by the end of the second.
That was wild.
And then they get a Kansas City team that seems to have pulled it together next week on the afternoon side of the main slate. That is going to be super fun. And if you told me when we woke up on Sunday that the run back options were all going to work on New England and that was going to be the game stacked play, I'm not sure I would have believed you.
Yeah,
everybody hit.
Yeah, that was crazy. And the CMC play, that was actually another late swap that like I actually kind of got lucky that my Tampa Bay stacks underperformed a little bit because I ended up swapping to a lot of CMC, so that worked out as well. I was surprised that we saw. I mean, obviously Ingram gets there late, and I think people are probably going to disagree with this because of the results we saw. I think playing Mark Ingram and Dearness Johnson in large field GPPs together was really bad. Obviously, the million winner, someone won $1 million with it. So tell me to shut up if you want to, and I get it. But to take on that much ownership with your two running backs, and again, we don't see spots like this very often where we get 2 free squares, but not only do they hit ceilings, I think Ingram actually hit his floor ownership. He was only 26% in the milli. Like, I think if we run that 100 times, 90% of the time he's like 35%. So I think he actually hits his floor ownership. So that helps a little bit too. And there's just so many ceiling backs and so many ways to pivot off of that build that was going to be a very popular build and was a very popular build. I think I tweeted this last night, if we reran this slate right now, I think I still don't play them again orange field stuff. But I'm very happy for the people that benefited. I think it was good in small field stuff. But I just thought it was a really interesting theory week. And I think there was actually a lot of lessons to be looked at if you were paying attention to things like that.
Yeah, and only to add a little bit, not to counter what you said, but I do think that it's possible to gain enough leverage with the rest of your lineup by saying an off-the-wall game stack and a run back option from that same off-the-wall game stack. Definitely. And then you just load it up with the chunk of chalk that we talked about on last Friday's theory segment. I'm happy for the person that won. It always takes a lot of randomness and a little bit of luck to get to the top of leaderboards anyway. So
yeah,
I see what you're saying for sure.
Yeah, and that's what happened. Like obviously they were unique enough outside of that, and that's how you have to be thinking if you are going to do that. I just thought it was really interesting that it got there. Because I think most of the time it probably doesn't. Anything any last thoughts on like general approaches or things to change going into next week?
Just a little bit. Just want to make sure when I'm late swapping to not overweight ownership or expected ownership and ceiling versus median projection. I think in general, I saw that the ceiling projections were fantastic for Thielen and Lockett, but I knew that there's a big difference in our value rankings between wide receiver 6 and wide receiver 16 among all wide receivers on the afternoon slate. That was a big dip to take. And when my budget allowed Justin Jefferson in there, I overthought it by reintroducing the ownership projections I knew were in the were incorporated into the value metric. So I double counted, which is
we don't want to double count. The thing you actually brought this up, and I didn't know you were going to bring it up, is how many teams you noticed with stacks in their cash lineups. And I leaned into it this week. A few weeks ago, we had the Rams game where I played 3 Rams in one cash lineup, and it's not something I'm forcing in cash games. And obviously, like in GPPs, I might have 8 players that are correlated in some fashion with mini stacks and whatnot. I'm obviously not doing that in cash games. But when these opportunities present themselves to have 2 or 3 players from one game, I think when values are equal and all other things are equal, I'm leaning into it a little bit more. There's an upside edge. I would even argue that there is like a safety edge when you get a Mike Evans and a Tyler Johnson, even though neither of them get there. Like if the big salary guy misses, but you have his counterpart that is going to be part of the reason he misses, I think you actually increase your floor a little bit in some of these higher scoring games. And like I said, leaning into the upside, the possibility of upside in cash games, like being able to get win some of your 10Xs, win some of these small tournaments or small leagues you might play with your cash lineups. We want to capitalize on those huge weeks. So I think I don't think we need to be shying away from stacks if all values are equal otherwise.
Yeah, I dig it, especially the ones in massive favorite games with huge totals.
Exactly. Yeah, and those are the ones we're doing it in cash, definitely.
Right.
All right. Well, that wraps it up for the cash game review for week 10. Now we are officially on to week 11. Please make sure you like this video as you're watching on YouTube. Make sure you're following the 4for4 YouTube channel. And please check out our other DFS MVP shows every Friday, 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time. We do our general overview value show, the regular DFS MVP, here on YouTube, also on all podcast platforms every Saturday. Yahoo DFS Values with Matt Harmon of Yahoo Fantasy. That comes out on the DFS MVP and the Yahoo Fantasy podcast feed. And Sunday mornings, the GPP Last Look show with Jordan Vanek. That's at 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time. That is in the 4for4 subscriber only Discord. So make sure you get signed up. That sign up link is in the show description below. Make sure you follow us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Matt's at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We will talk to you guys on Friday.